I was not searching for living stone when the photograph surfaced. I was looking for routine civil records, the kind that sit untouched in municipal drawers for decades. Maintenance logs, engineering sketches, surveyor notes. Instead, what I found were images that refused to behave. Sepia-toned prints, edges curled, corners stained by time. Bridges rising from riverbanks in thick, ribbed arcs, their surfaces patterned in a way that resembled mineral growth rather than stacked masonry. The spans were enormous, too tall for the traffic lanes beneath them, too heavy for the narrow foundations marked on the accompanying plans. Even before I started measuring, something felt wrong. In one archive, a clerk slid the folder across the desk and then lingered, hands folded, watching without speaking. The next request produced only a partial ledger, several pages torn cleanly from the binding. When I asked where the rest had gone, the answer arrived after a pause that stretched just long enough to register. "Probably relocated," she said. Nothing more. The bridges were never presented as marvels. No celebratory articles, no civic dedications, just structures already standing, already normalized, already old, which made the absence louder than any headline. If these spans had not been remarkable, why did their records feel so carefully thinned? And if no one thought to document their creation, who exactly had built them in the first place? The second set of documents was harder to ignore. Blueprint overlays, cross-sections sketched in fading ink, stone inventories written in cramped 19th century handwriting. The measurements alone forced me to slow down. Pier widths too narrow for the loads above them, arches spanning distances that would normally demand iron reinforcement decades before such techniques were supposedly common, courses of stone stacked in interlocking curves rather than straight tiers, the blocks shaped so that weight traveled downward and outward at once, distributing stress with unsettling elegance. What unsettled me more was the surface patterning. Close-up photographs showed ridges along the masonry that looked less chiseled and accreted, mineral seams flowing around joints as if the structure had thickened over time, rather than being assembled all at once. Lichen did not behave like that. Weathering did not either. Engineering memos surfaced next, brief, technical, unsigned. Load tolerances calculated in margins, river current models sketched and crossed out. One surveyor had written a single line beside a diagram of a central pier. Growth irregular but stable. Growth. The word sat there unqualified. Construction records should have followed. Crew lists, quarry invoices, transport schedules. Instead, the folders jumped ahead to inspections and maintenance, as though the bridges had simply appeared and entered the bureaucratic routine of upkeep without ever passing through the stage of creation. The numbers refused to align with the story that accompanied them. Not one span, not two, multiple bridges across different waterways, sharing proportions, stone types, curvature profiles. Experiments do not replicate themselves across regions. Systems do. Once the engineering stopped behaving, I turned to maps. Municipal atlases first, then river authority charts. Then the kind of privately published survey books that engineers once carried, folded into coat pockets. Early editions were blunt. Thick ink lines traced the bridges cleanly across waterways, annotated with dates, pier counts, load classes. Some even included marginal sketches of the arches, exaggerated in ways that suddenly felt less decorative and more precise. Later printings softened them. The spans shrank. Labels changed. One atlas replaced a bridge designation with a simple crossing mark, no name attached. Another omitted the structure entirely, routing traffic across empty water as though the stone had never existed. Revisions appeared without explanation. No margin notes, no errata slips. Archivists serviced only as signatures at the bottoms of pages, redacted stamps, a session number scratched out and rewritten. A librarian once tapped a brittle chart with her finger and murmured, "That version isn't circulated anymore." Then she slid it back into its drawer. I began stacking the editions chronologically. The pattern sharpened. Between early surveys and 20th century revisions, the same handful of bridges, blurred, relocated, or vanished from official cartography. Not after floods, not after demolitions, after paperwork. And the dates clustered closer than I liked. Late 19th century, right where the record was supposed to be thickest, right where the title year weighted, uncomfortably specific. The ledgers arrived next, bound volumes with warped spines and ink that had browned with age, listing stone tonnage, barge rentals, iron fasteners, rib shipments, quarry contracts stretching across counties. The quantities were staggering. Hundreds of tons recorded in tidy columns, repeated orders for shaped blocks larger than anything described in the bridge specifications themselves. What never appeared were the names. No crew rosters, no pay rates by head count, no transport foreman, just totals, just invoices, just signatures that looped into themselves, illegible and identical from page to page. One shipping manifest noted a week-long unloading operation at a riverside depot, but the section marked labor allocation was blank. Another listed cranes rented at triple the expected duration, yet offered no explanation for who operated them. A contract for stone shaping referenced on-site preparation, followed by nothing at all. I began calculating backwards: volume of stone, timeframes, river currents, the manpower required to lift, cut, and place pieces of that scale using 19th century tools. The numbers refused to cooperate. Even generously staffed crews would have struggled to meet those schedules. The costs implied something far larger than the recorded workforce, or something absent from the record entirely. And yet the paperwork continued after construction should have ended, shifting tone, shifting vocabulary, maintenance, inspection, stabilization, as though the bridges had passed quietly from creation into stewardship, skipping the only phase that should have left the thickest paper trail. Natural explanations were coming. I could feel them waiting in the margins. They always arrive after the math stops working. The plaques came after the paperwork. Bronze plates mounted near river walks, small museum cards tucked beside scale models, engineering summaries printed in neutral fonts and clipped to display boards. Decorative, experimental, overbuilt for civic pride. The language was gentle, almost apologetic, as though excess itself were the only mystery worth acknowledging. I started tracing publication dates. Most of the explanations arrived late, years after the bridges had already begun thinning from maps, decades after the construction records stopped mid-sentence. Scholarly articles cited surveys that no longer existed in the archives they referenced. Footnotes pointed toward reports that had been reclassified, moved, or reduced to fragments. One pamphlet claimed the exaggerated arches were symbolic, a flourish meant to impress travelers entering prosperous towns. Another suggested provisional prototypes for methods that never caught on. A third dismissed the ribbed stone patterns as quirks of quarry output. None addressed the loads. None addressed the manpower. None explained why the same quirks appeared across distant rivers. In reading rooms, I noticed how questions stalled conversations. Curators spoke in careful loops. Professors leaned back, folded their hands, and redirected toward broader historical trends. No one raised their voice. No one refused outright. They simply moved on, and the timing kept returning. Each official explanation surfaced only after the earlier trail had already faded, as though the narrative had been written not to illuminate the bridges, but to close the space where better questions had once been waiting. Once the pattern emerged locally, it refused to stay contained. River by river, archive by archive, the same silhouettes surfaced. Broad stone ribs rising from currents, pier geometries that echoed each other despite being separated by thousands of miles. Curvature ratios, repeating with a precision that made coincidence feel mathematically thin. Foreign municipal collections opened into the same quiet corridors. Port Authority filings listed load classes that exceeded known traffic volumes for their eras. Navigation charts showed clearance heights more appropriate for vessels that never appeared pracked in shipping logs. Maintenance circulars crossed languages and borders yet preserved the same restrained phrasing, the same absence of origin stories. I began laying timelines across one another: construction windows, clustered, revision dates overlapped, disappearances synchronized, structures that had stood unquestioned for decades slipped from public records within the same generational span, regardless of nation or governing body. Bridges in separate legal systems entered the same bureaucratic fog, almost in unison, different rivers, different governments, identical erasures. At that scale, accidents lose their individuality. What remained was repetition, and repetition, stretched across borders, stops feeling random. The silence did not arrive gradually. It landed between editions. In one decade, bridge inspections still included sketches of original stonework, notes on settling, marginal calculations penciled by engineers who clearly expected to return. In the next, the same files narrowed into restoration permits, resurfacing authorizations, reinforcement orders, entire sections devoted to cosmetic repairs, none acknowledging what had existed before. Photographs followed the same pattern. Early plates showed the full spans rising raw from riverbanks, untouched by later railings or widened roadbeds. Later collections cropped, the arches, shifted angles, focused on traffic rather than structure. By the turn of the century, the bridges survived only as background scenery, stripped of scale, reduced to infrastructure instead of subjects. Demolition permits surfaced in parallel, partial dismantling of decorative stonework, lowering of parapets, replacement of non-essential features. Urban planning documents listed elevation changes that made no mention of floods or collapses, only modernization, efficiency, streamlining. No report described why so much stone was being removed. No committee minutes debated the original designs. Construction logs never resumed. Across dozens of cities, the story halted at the same chapter. Creation ended. Maintenance took over. And behind it all, the dates kept repeating. Late 19th century, the moment when bridges stopped being built and started being corrected, when questions disappeared faster than structures, when erasure became administrative rather than accidental. Whatever came next would not be local. That much was already clear. By the time the paper trails collapsed into silence, the structures themselves had begun to feel less like isolated achievements and more like remnants. The bridges, taken together, implied coordination, shared proportions, identical stress tolerances, stone sourced from distant quarries yet cut to near uniform curvature profiles, foundations aligned with river dynamics that 19th century hydrology texts barely addressed. These were not civic flourishes scattered by coincidence. They behaved like components. Systems leave fingerprints. I started mapping design traits instead of locations, arch radii, pier spacing, subsurface anchoring depth. The same ratios surfaced again and again, drifting across borders the way industrial standards would decades later. The implication was difficult to ignore. Someone had been working at scale, not towns, not provinces, networks. Whoever shaped these crossings understood towed paths that modern bridge engineers still treat cautiously. They anticipated sediment drift patterns before river commissions existed. They embedded redundancy into stone the way later builders would hide it inside steel. The documents never named them. What survived were roles implied by design. Operators who could access maintenance points positioned far above conventional scaffolding reach. Maintainers whose tasks made sense only if bodies were proportioned for spaces modern workers now treat as ornamental voids. Builders inferred from architecture rather than payroll. And if such a class had existed, if they had overseen systems this coordinated, then the erasure that followed would have needed to be just as organized. Civilizations do not vanish overnight. Their stories do. The question pressing hardest now was no longer how these bridges were built. It was why the people who understood them were removed from the record. At the same moment, the structures were reclassified, softened, and quietly absorbed into a safer narrative. The first clues were not architectural. They were geological. Core samples taken during renovations showed sediment packed against stone faces that should have remained exposed, stratified layers pressed into decorative reliefs, river silt trapped high above historical flood marks. In some places, entire lower arches had been sealed behind later embankments, their original profiles surviving only in maintenance tunnels that no longer appeared on public maps. Inspection reports disagreed about how it happened. One assessment attributed the buildup to 19th century flooding cycles that were never recorded elsewhere in the watershed. Another described controlled backfilling conducted during infrastructure stabilization, though no stabilizing authority was named. A third flagged the deposits as inconsistent with long-term erosion, noting compaction patterns that suggested rapid placement rather than slow accumulation. The contradictions were subtle. They lived in footnotes, margins. Technical appendices rarely read outside regulatory review. Geologists framed the deposits as natural, yet could not align them with regional sediment models. Structural inspectors documented stone removal that exceeded repair needs. Disposal manifests logged thousands of tons of carved blocks classified simply as rubble, without drawings or photographs attached. What unsettled me most was the precision. Sections were removed where internal conduits intersected with load-bearing chambers. Access points vanished behind concrete skins. Drainage channels that once ran beneath the decks ended abruptly, capped without explanation. This was not decay. It resembled editing. If entire systems had been dismantled, then what vanished with the masonry was not ornamental. It was operational. The question forming now was unavoidable. What knowledge had been entombed alongside the stone? By this point, the evidence no longer felt scattered. It felt curated. Each omission lined up too cleanly. Every vanished photograph corresponded to a redesign. Each truncated map coincided with renovation budgets large enough to dismantle systems without leaving architectural scars. Wherever operational features disappeared, a new explanatory plaque appeared soon after, offering language that dulled curiosity rather than sharpened it. No signature followed those changes. Permits were approved by committees, archives updated by departments, revisions attributed to administrative review, authority diffused until it could no longer be traced. The pattern raised questions that refused to resolve into anything comfortable. Who decided these bridges were merely decorative? Who approved the removal of components engineers once measured with obsessive care? Why were systems dismantled instead of studied, documented instead of preserved? When did investigation give way to normalization? Somewhere in the record, that shift had occurred, not through a decree, through quiet alignment. Language softened, diagrams simplified, complexity reframed as ornament. The structures remained, but stripped of the very features that made them difficult to explain. And beneath the stonework that still spanned rivers, beneath embankments poured long after the last construction crews vanished, the unanswered problems continued to accumulate. What technologies no longer appear in textbooks because their operators disappeared first? What infrastructural knowledge died when maintenance replaced mastery? What kind of society builds systems so advanced that later generations dismantle them rather than confront what they imply? The investigation does not end here. It cannot. The bridges still stand. The records remain fractured, and the silence around their origins grows heavier the longer it persists.